Jamal sat at his desk, his pencil moving steadily across the worksheet in front of him. The classroom was quiet, save for the soft hum of the air conditioner and the occasional rustle of paper. It was a typical Tuesday morning at Maplewood Elementary, and Jamal, a bright and well-behaved 10-year-old, was focused on finishing his math problems. He liked math. It made sense to him, numbers followed rules, and if you knew the rules, you could always find the right answer. Life, he thought, should be more like math. He was a quiet kid, the kind who always raised his hand before speaking and never caused trouble. His teacher, Mrs. Thompson, often praised him for his good behavior and hard work. Jamal liked making her proud. He liked making his parents proud, too. They always told him how important it was to do well in school, and he took their words to heart. But today, something felt off. Jamal couldn't quite put his finger on it, but the air in the classroom seemed heavier than usual. He glanced up from his worksheet and scanned the room. His classmates were all busy with their work, their heads bent over their desks. Mrs. Thompson was at her computer, typing something. Everything looked normal, but Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. And then, the door burst open. 2 school security officers walked in, their boots clomping loudly against the tile floor. They were big men, dressed in dark uniforms with badges glinting on their chests. Their faces were stern, their eyes scanning the room like they were looking for trouble. Jamal froze, his pencil hovering above his paper. He didn't know why they were here, but the sight of them made his stomach twist. "Jamal Carter," one of the officers said, his voice booming through the room. "Stand up." Jamal's heart skipped a beat. He looked around, confused. Had he done something wrong? He couldn't think of anything. He'd been sitting quietly, doing his work, just like always. But the officers were staring right at him, their expressions hard and unyielding. "Jamal," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice tight. "Do as they say." Jamal stood up slowly, his legs feeling like they were made of jelly. The whole class was watching now, their eyes wide with curiosity and fear. He could feel their stares like a weight pressing down on him. His face burned with embarrassment, but he didn't know what to do. He just stood there, clutching his pencil, waiting for someone to tell him what was going on. The officers stepped closer, their boots echoing in the silence. One of them reached for the handcuffs on his belt, and Jamal's breath caught in his throat. Handcuffs? Why would they need handcuffs? He wasn't a criminal. He was just a kid. "Turn around," the officer said, his voice cold and commanding. Jamal shook his head, his eyes filling with tears. "I didn't do anything," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I promise, I didn't do anything." "Turn around," the officer repeated, louder this time. Jamal's legs felt like they were going to give out. He looked at Mrs. Thompson, hoping she would say something, do something, but she just stood there, her face pale and her lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't even look at him. The officer grabbed Jamal's arm and spun him around, forcing his hands behind his back. Jamal gasped as the cold metal of the handcuffs clamped around his wrists. He tried to pull away, but the officer's grip was too strong. Tears streamed down his face as he was led out of the classroom, his classmates staring in stunned silence. Some of them pulled out their phones, recording the scene with shaking hands. Jamal wanted to scream, to tell them to stop, but he couldn't find his voice. He felt like he was trapped in a nightmare, one he couldn't wake up from. The officers marched him down the hallway, their footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. Jamal's mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Why were they doing this? What had he done? He thought about his parents, about how scared they would be if they saw him like this. He thought about his little sister, who looked up to him and always wanted to play with him after school. He thought about how much he just wanted to go home, but there was no going home now. The officers led him out of the school and into the parking lot, where a police car was waiting. Jamal's heart pounded as they opened the door and pushed him into the back seat. He'd never been in a police car before. He'd never even been in trouble before. But now, he was being treated like a criminal. And he didn't know why. The ride to the police station was a blur. Jamal stared out the window, his tears blurring the passing buildings and trees. He felt like he was in a daze, like none of this could really be happening. But the handcuffs digging into his wrists were real. The cold, hard seat beneath him was real. And the fear twisting in his stomach was real, too. When they arrived at the station, the officers led him inside and sat him down in a small, windowless room. They didn't explain anything, didn't tell him why he was there or what was going to happen next. They just left him there, alone and scared, with nothing but his thoughts for company. Jamal sat there for what felt like hours, his mind racing with questions. Why had this happened? What was going to happen to him? Would he ever get to go home? He thought about his parents again, about how worried they must be. They didn't even know where he was. No one had called them. No one had told them anything. Finally, the door opened, and Jamal looked up, hoping to see his mom or dad. But it was just another officer, holding a clipboard and looking at him with a frown. "Jamal Carter?" the officer asked, even though he already knew the answer. Jamal nodded, his throat too tight to speak. The officer sat down across from him and started asking questions. What had he been doing in class? Had he been causing trouble? Had he threatened anyone? Jamal shook his head, his tears falling faster. He hadn't done anything wrong. He didn't understand why they were treating him like this, but the officer didn't seem to care. He just kept asking questions, his voice cold and detached, like he was reading from a script. Jamal felt like he was drowning, like the walls of the room were closing in on him. He just wanted to go home. Jamal's parents, Marcus and Lisa Carter, were at work when they received the call. It wasn't from the school or the police station. It was from a neighbor whose child attended Maplewood Elementary. The neighbor had seen the videos circulating online and immediately recognized Jamal. Her voice was shaky as she explained what had happened, and Lisa felt her heart drop into her stomach. "They handcuffed him?" Lisa repeated, her voice trembling. "My son? Are you sure?" "I'm so sorry, Lisa," the neighbor said. "I thought you should know right away." Lisa hung up the phone and turned to Marcus, who was already grabbing his car keys. Neither of them said much as they rushed to the police station. Their minds were racing, trying to make sense of how their sweet, quiet son could have ended up in handcuffs. Jamal wasn't a troublemaker. He wasn't violent. He was just a kid who loved math and video games and spending time with his family. When they arrived at the station, they were met with a wall of bureaucracy. The officers at the front desk were polite but unhelpful, telling them they needed to wait for someone to give them more information. Marcus clenched his fists, trying to keep his anger in check. Lisa paced back and forth, her eyes darting to every door, hoping to catch a glimpse of Jamal. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they were led to a small room where Jamal was sitting. He looked so small in the hard plastic chair, his shoulders hunched and his eyes red from crying. When he saw his parents, he jumped up and ran to them, burying his face in Lisa's chest. "Mom, I didn't do anything," he sobbed. "I promise, I didn't do anything." Lisa held him tightly, her own tears falling into his hair. Marcus knelt down beside them, his hand resting on Jamal's back. "We know, buddy," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We know you didn't." The officer who had brought them in stood awkwardly by the door, clearing his throat. "We're just following protocol," he said, as if that explained everything. "Protocol?" Marcus snapped, standing up to face the officer. What kind of protocol involves handcuffing a 10-year-old boy for no reason? The officer shifted uncomfortably. "The school reported him for acting suspiciously. We had to respond to the call." "Suspiciously?" Lisa repeated, her voice rising. "What does that even mean? He's a child." The officer didn't have an answer. He just shrugged and muttered something about needing to follow orders. Marcus and Lisa exchanged a look, their anger simmering beneath the surface. They knew this wasn't the time or place to argue, but they also knew they couldn't let this go. Their son had been treated like a criminal, and they needed to know why. After filling out what felt like endless paperwork, they were finally allowed to take Jamal home. He was quiet on the ride back, his face pressed against the window as he watched the world go by. Lisa reached back from the passenger seat to hold his hand, her heart breaking at how small and fragile he looked. When they got home, Jamal's little sister, Maya, was waiting for them. She was only 7, but she could tell something was wrong. "Why is Jamal crying?" she asked, her big brown eyes filled with worry. "It's okay, sweetheart," Lisa said, forcing a smile. "Jamal just had a rough day at school." Maya didn't look convinced, but she didn't ask any more questions. She just hugged her brother tightly, as if she could somehow make everything better. Jamal hugged her back, but his mind was still far away, stuck in that small, windowless room at the police station. That night, as Jamal lay in bed, he couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. He replayed the scene over and over in his mind. The officers walking into the classroom, the handcuffs clicking around his wrists, the way his classmates had stared at him like he was some kind of monster. He felt a lump in his throat as he remembered the videos they had taken. Were they online now? Were people watching him, judging him, thinking he was a bad kid? He didn't understand why this had happened to him. He hadn't done anything wrong. He'd just been sitting there, doing his work, like he always did. But for some reason, that hadn't been enough. For some reason, he'd been seen as a threat. Jamal rolled over and buried his face in his pillow, trying to stifle his sobs. He didn't want his parents to hear him crying. He didn't want to worry them any more than he already had. But the tears wouldn't stop, and neither would the questions swirling in his mind. Why had this happened? Was it because of the color of his skin? He'd heard his parents talk about racism before, about how some people treated black folks differently just because of how they looked. But he'd never thought it would happen to him. He was just a kid. He didn't think anyone could see him as a threat. But now, he wasn't so sure. The next morning, the videos of Jamal's arrest were everywhere. They had been shared thousands of times on social media, and news outlets were picking up the story. People were outraged, demanding answers. How could a 10-year-old boy be treated like a criminal? What kind of school would call the police on a child for acting suspiciously? Marcus and Lisa were overwhelmed by the attention. Their phones wouldn't stop ringing, and reporters were camped out on their front lawn. They didn't know how to handle it all, but they knew they had to do something. They couldn't let this go. They couldn't let what happened to Jamal be swept under the rug. They decided to hold a press conference, to tell their side of the story and demand accountability. They didn't know if it would make a difference, but they had to try. For Jamal. For all the other kids who might be treated the same way. As they stood in front of the cameras, with Jamal by their side, Lisa took a deep breath and began to speak. "Our son is a good kid," she said, her voice steady despite the anger and pain in her heart. "He's kind, he's smart, and he's never been in trouble a day in his life. But yesterday, he was treated like a criminal, not because of anything he did, but because of how he looks. That's not right. That's not justice. And we won't stop fighting until something is done about it." The crowd erupted into applause, but Marcus and Lisa didn't feel like celebrating. They knew this was just the beginning. The fight for justice was far from over. The videos of Jamal's arrest spread like wildfire. By the end of the day, they had been shared on every major social media platform, and the hashtag justice for Jamal was trending worldwide. People from all walks of life were outraged: parents, teachers, activists, celebrities, and even politicians. How could a 10-year-old boy be treated like this? What kind of system allowed something so unjust to happen? The school administration was quick to release a statement, but it only made things worse. They claimed that the officers had been following protocol, and that their actions were necessary to ensure the safety of the students. But no one was buying it. The public wanted answers, not excuses. Marcus and Lisa were inundated with messages of support. Strangers from across the country reached out to offer their help, their prayers, and their solidarity. It was overwhelming. But also comforting. They weren't alone in this fight. People cared. People wanted to see justice done. But not everyone was on their side. There were those who defended the school and the officers, claiming that Jamal must have done something to warrant such a response. These comments were few and far between, but they cut deep. Marcus and Lisa tried to ignore them, but it was hard not to feel the sting of judgment, even from strangers. Meanwhile, Jamal was struggling. He didn't want to go back to school. He didn't want to face his classmates, who had seen him humiliated and handcuffed. He didn't want to see Mrs. Thompson, who had done nothing to stop it. He just wanted to hide, to disappear. to pretend like none of this had ever happened. But he couldn't. The world was watching, and there was no escaping it. The protest started small, just a handful of people gathering outside the school with signs that read, "Justice for Jamal," and "Handcuffs are not for children." But within days, the crowd had grown to hundreds. People of all ages and backgrounds came together to demand accountability. They chanted, they sang, they shared their own stories of injustice. It was a powerful display of solidarity, but it was also a painful reminder of how deep the problem ran. The school board held an emergency meeting to address the growing backlash. They invited Marcus and Lisa to speak, but it was clear that they were more concerned with damage control than with actually listening. The board members sat at a long table, their faces stern and unyielding, as Marcus and Lisa poured their hearts out. "Our son is not a criminal," Lisa said, her voice shaking with emotion. "He's a child. A child who was traumatized by the very people who were supposed to protect him. This isn't just about Jamal. It's about every child who has ever been treated unfairly because of the color of their skin. We need change. Real change." The room erupted into applause, but the board members remained unmoved. They thanked Marcus and Lisa for their time and promised to look into the matter. It was a hollow response, and everyone knew it. As the days turned into weeks, the story continued to gain momentum. News outlets dug deeper, uncovering similar cases of racial profiling in schools across the country. It was a disturbing pattern, one that had been ignored for far too long. Parents shared their own experiences, their voices trembling with anger and pain. It was clear that Jamal's story was just the tip of the iceberg. Activists and legal experts joined the fight, calling for systemic change. They demanded that the school district review its policies and implement anti-racist training for all staff. They also called for the officers involved in Jamal's arrest to be held accountable. But the school district was slow to act, and the officers were placed on paid leave, a move that only fueled the public's anger. Marcus and Lisa were exhausted. They were grateful for the support, but the constant attention was taking its toll. They just wanted to focus on their son, to help him heal from the trauma he had endured. But they knew they couldn't stop fighting. Not yet. Not until something changed. The protests outside Maplewood Elementary grew larger and louder with each passing day. What had started as a small gathering of concerned parents and community members had now turned into a full-blown movement. People from neighboring towns and even other states traveled to join the demonstrations, their voices united in demanding justice for Jamal and an end to racial profiling in schools. The media coverage was relentless. News vans lined the streets, and reporters interviewed anyone willing to speak. Marcus and Lisa found themselves at the center of it all, their faces plastered across newspapers and television screens. They were grateful for the platform, but it was overwhelming. Every interview, every statement, every public appearance felt like a battle, one they couldn't afford to lose. One evening, after a long day of meetings and interviews, Marcus sat down with Jamal in the living room. The boy had been quieter than usual, his usual spark dimmed by the weight of everything that had happened. Marcus put a hand on his son's shoulder and asked, "How are you holding up, buddy?" Jamal shrugged, his eyes fixed on the floor. "I don't know," he mumbled. I don't get why this happened to me. I didn't do anything wrong." Marcus's heart ached. He pulled Jamal into a hug, holding him tightly. "I know, son. And I'm so sorry you're going through this. But what happened to you isn't your fault. You didn't deserve it, and we're going to make sure nothing like this ever happens to you, or anyone else, again." Jamal nodded, but his expression remained troubled. "What if people at school still think I'm a bad kid?" he asked quietly. Marcus sighed, struggling to find the right words. "The people who matter know the truth, Jamal. And the ones who don't, well, they're the ones who need to change, not you." The school district, under mounting pressure, finally announced a public forum to address the incident. Parents, students, and community members were invited to attend and share their thoughts. The auditorium was packed, the air thick with tension and anticipation. Marcus and Lisa sat in the front row, Jamal between them, his small hand clutching his mother's. The forum began with a statement from the school board president, a middle-aged man named Mr. Harris. He spoke in measured tones, expressing regret for the unfortunate incident and promising a thorough review of the district's policies. But his words felt hollow, and the crowd grew restless. When it was time for public comments, Marcus was the first to step up to the microphone. He took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the room. "My name is Marcus Carter," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I'm Jamal's father. What happened to my son wasn't just an unfortunate incident. It was a failure of the system that's supposed to protect our children. Jamal is 10 years old. He's a good kid. He's never been in trouble. But because of the color of his skin, he was treated like a criminal. That's not right, and it's not enough to just say you're sorry. We need action. We need change." The room erupted into applause, but Marcus wasn't finished. "This isn't just about Jamal," he continued. "It's about every child who's ever been unfairly targeted because of who they are. It's about making sure no other parent has to go through what we've been through. So I'm asking you, no, I'm demanding you, to do better. For Jamal. For all our kids." Lisa spoke next, her voice trembling but resolute. She shared how the incident had affected their family, how Jamal had gone from a confident, happy child to one who was anxious and afraid. "Our son didn't just lose his sense of safety that day," she said. "He lost his trust in the people who are supposed to protect him, and that's something no child should ever have to go through." One by one, others stepped forward to share their stories. A mother talked about how her son had been suspended for talking back when he was just defending himself against a bully. A high school student described how she was constantly followed by security guards at her school, even though she had never done anything wrong. The stories were different, but the theme was the same: racial bias was alive and well in schools, and it was hurting children. By the end of the forum, the school board looked visibly shaken. Mr. Harris promised to take the community's concerns seriously and announced the formation of a task force to review the district's policies. It was a small step, but it was a step nonetheless. As the weeks went on, the pressure on the school district continued to mount. Activists organized rallies and marches, and legal experts began exploring potential lawsuits. The officers involved in Jamal's arrest were placed on unpaid leave, and the school principal, who had initially defended their actions, resigned under pressure. But for Marcus and Lisa, the fight was far from over. They knew that real change wouldn't come overnight. They met with lawyers, activists, and community leaders, determined to turn their pain into progress. They also made sure to prioritize Jamal's well-being, enrolling him in counseling to help him process his trauma. One evening, as the family sat down for dinner, Jamal looked up from his plate and asked, "Do you think things will ever get better?" Lisa reached across the table and took his hand. "They will, baby," she said softly. "It might take time, but they will. And we're going to keep fighting until they do." Jamal nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. For the first time in weeks, he looked hopeful. The legal battle began in earnest. Marcus and Lisa, with the help of a team of lawyers and civil rights advocates, filed a lawsuit against the school district. They sought not only compensation for the emotional and psychological trauma Jamal had endured but also systemic changes to prevent similar incidents from happening in the future. The lawsuit sent shockwaves through the community, forcing the district to confront the deep-seated issues within its policies and practices. The case quickly gained national attention. Legal experts weighed in, calling it a landmark moment in the fight against racial profiling in schools. Activists rallied behind the Carter family, organizing fundraisers and awareness campaigns to support their cause. The hashtag Justice for Jamal continued to trend, a constant reminder of the public's demand for accountability. For Marcus and Lisa, the legal process was grueling. They spent countless hours in meetings with their legal team, reviewing documents, and preparing for depositions. It was exhausting, but they refused to back down. They knew this was bigger than their family. It was about creating a safer, fairer world for all children. Jamal, meanwhile, was slowly beginning to heal. His counseling sessions helped him process his emotions, and he started to open up about how the incident had affected him. He still struggled with anxiety, especially when it came to school, but his parents' unwavering support gave him the strength to keep going. One afternoon, As Jamal sat in his counselor's office, he asked, "Why do some people treat others differently just because of how they look?" His counselor, a kind woman named Dr. Patel, smiled gently. "That's a big question, Jamal," she said. "The truth is, some people have biases, ways of thinking that aren't fair or right. Sometimes, they don't even realize they have them. But that doesn't make it okay. What happened to you wasn't your fault. It was the result of someone else's biases, and that's something we need to change." Jamal nodded, absorbing her words. "I just want things to be fair," he said quietly. "Me too," Dr. Patel replied. "And the more people like you and your family speak up, the closer we get to making that happen." The school district, facing mounting legal and public pressure, began to take steps toward reform. They announced a series of initiatives aimed at addressing racial bias, including mandatory anti-racism training for all staff and a review of their security protocols. They also pledged to create a task force made up of parents, students, and community leaders to oversee the changes. While these steps were promising, Marcus and Lisa remained cautious. They had seen too many empty promises in the past to take the district's words at face value. They continued to push for transparency and accountability, determined to ensure that the reforms were more than just lip service. One of the most significant developments came when the district agreed to ban the use of handcuffs on students except in cases of imminent danger. It was a small but important victory, one that Marcus and Lisa celebrated as a step in the right direction. As the legal battle dragged on, the Carter family found strength in their community. Strangers sent letters of support, sharing their own stories of injustice and offering words of encouragement. Local organizations hosted events to raise awareness and funds for the family's legal expenses. Even Jamal's classmates rallied around him, organizing a walkout to demand change at their school. One evening, as Marcus and Lisa sat on the porch after a long day, Marcus turned to his wife and said, "We're not alone in this, are we?" Lisa shook her head, a small smile playing on her lips. "No, we're not. And that's what gives me hope." The trial began on a crisp autumn morning, the courtroom packed with supporters, journalists, and curious onlookers. Marcus and Lisa sat at the plaintiff's table, their hands clasped tightly together. Jamal was there too, dressed in a suit and tie, his small frame dwarfed by the imposing surroundings. He had insisted on being present, determined to face the system that had failed him. The district's lawyers argued that the officers had been following protocol and that their actions were justified given the potential threat Jamal supposedly posed. They painted a picture of a school environment where safety was paramount, even if it meant making difficult decisions. But their arguments rang hollow, especially when the videos of Jamal's arrest were played in court. The sight of a 10-year-old boy in handcuffs, his face streaked with tears, was enough to silence even the most skeptical observer. Marcus and Lisa's legal team, led by a seasoned civil rights attorney named Angela Morales, presented a compelling case. They called expert witnesses to testify about the psychological impact of the incident on Jamal, as well as the broader issue of racial profiling in schools. They also highlighted the district's history of disproportionately disciplining black students, presenting data that showed a clear pattern of bias. One of the most powerful moments came when Jamal himself took the stand. He spoke softly but clearly, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "I just want to feel safe at school," he said, his eyes meeting the judge's. "I want to be treated like a kid, not a criminal." The courtroom was silent, the gravity of his words sinking in. Even the district's lawyers seemed momentarily shaken. When Jamal stepped down from the stand, Marcus and Lisa pulled him into a tight hug, their pride and love for their son shining through. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the judge finally issued her ruling. She found the school district liable for the emotional and psychological harm caused to Jamal and ordered them to pay significant damages. But more importantly, she mandated a series of sweeping reforms, including the implementation of anti-racist training for all staff, the creation of a student oversight committee, and the establishment of clear guidelines for when law enforcement could be involved in school incidents. It was a landmark decision, one that sent a powerful message to schools across the country. Marcus and Lisa felt a mix of relief and exhaustion as they left the courtroom, their son by their side. They knew the fight wasn't over, systemic change would take time, but they had taken a crucial step forward. In the months that followed, the school district began implementing the mandated reforms. Teachers and staff underwent training to recognize and address their biases, and students were given a greater voice in shaping school policies. The changes weren't always smooth, and there were moments of resistance, but progress was being made. Jamal, now in middle school, began to find his footing again. He joined a student advocacy group, using his voice to speak out against injustice and inspire others to do the same. His confidence grew, and though the scars of his experience remained, they no longer defined him. One evening, as the family sat around the dinner table, Jamal looked at his parents and said, "I think what happened to me, it wasn't just bad. It made people see what's wrong and try to fix it. Maybe that's a good thing." Marcus and Lisa exchanged a glance, their hearts swelling with pride. "You're right, Jamal," Lisa said, reaching over to squeeze his hand. "Sometimes, the hardest moments can lead to the biggest changes, and you've been so brave through all of it." The story of Jamal Carter became a symbol of hope and resilience, a reminder that even in the face of injustice, change is possible. His family's fight sparked a national conversation about racial bias in schools, leading to policy changes and a renewed commitment to equity and inclusion. As Marcus, Lisa, and Jamal stood together on the steps of their home one evening, watching the sun set over their neighborhood, they felt a sense of peace. The road ahead would still have challenges, but they knew they had made a difference, not just for themselves, but for countless others. And in that moment, they knew they had won more than a legal battle. They had won a brighter future for their son, and for all the children who would come after him.
If you enjoyed this content, please leave a like and drop a comment below letting us know where you're listening from. It helps this channel grow more than you know. Have a nice day.